Hi everybody, and welcome to this video set for our coursework. Now, what I'm going to do in this video is I'm going to look at anti-Semitism and its history and its origins and the different types of anti-Semitism. Obviously, this is a really difficult subject, and one thing to be really mindful in this, I am simply telling the story of how anti-Semitism developed, and I am expressing, or I'm going to be talking through the views of anti-Semites through history, a lot of which is really unpleasant, and I'm not advocating it, I'm not supporting it, I'm absolutely against it. I am just trying to inform you about the anti-Semitism that was held in the past. Right, now, unfortunately, there is a really long history of anti-Semitism. The origins of anti-Semitism are largely religious. And we can go all the way back to the time of the Romans with this. And there's a story around Emperor Caligula, who wanted a statue of himself erected in the main temple in Judea, in Jerusalem, and didn't understand, as a polytheist, somebody who was worshipped many gods, why the Jews would only have a single god and wouldn't accept him and the other Roman gods alongside. He also is said to have mocked a group of senior Jewish figures who went to plead the case for him not building his statue in their temple, and he teased them about various parts of their practices, including their refusal to eat pork. So the Romans clashed with both Jews and then later with Christians over their religious beliefs, and that was this kind of gap between monotheism and polytheism. So the Romans were very tolerant of other gods as long as you accepted theirs, and neither the Jews or the Christians would accept the Roman gods, and so were persecuted by the Romans. Then if we move into medieval kind of Christian Europe, then we see a continuation of religious anti-Semitism, which is now based on kind of accusations of the Jews having killed Jesus. I mean, it is really ridiculous. It kind of ignores the fact that obviously Jesus would have been Jewish. And then there's this continuing animosity because the Jewish minority is seen as refusing to accept Christ, because in Jewish faith, Jesus is not seen as the Son of God, and so because that was such a key part of Christianity, there was a lot of animosity towards the Jews for seemingly refusing to accept what the Christians believed to be the Saviour. There was also a lot of misinformation about Jewish practices, and some of these ideas lasted all the way through, and you still will see, unfortunately, some of these things even crop up in the modern day, but there were definitely things that were used by groups like the Nazis, in particularly in a publication called Der Strömer, which was really extreme. And there was lots of ideas about Jewish practices and something they called the blood libel, which is a complete lie. It's completely made up. And this idea that there was a Jewish ceremony involved the blood of Christian children. It's utter nonsense, but people believed it, and it caused anti-Semitism. There's also this big thing in medieval Europe, which develops in terms of the unpopularity of some of the Jewish minority, and it goes to religious laws. Now, the Christian laws at the time were that you couldn't charge interest and lend money. So you couldn't lend money to somebody and charge them interest. Now, there's a difference in religious law in Judaism where they can lend money to non-Jews and charge interest according to the Jewish teaching. So all moneylenders in Europe, or almost all moneylenders in Europe, were Jewish, and this led to this kind of really negative stereotyping, which we see in a very anti-Semitic portrayal of a Jewish moneylender, Shylock, in The Merchant of Venice, which is one of Shakespeare's plays. So we then see, and this is kind of as it goes on, it just gets more and more upsetting, makes me more angry the more I think about it. Is you've then got this really long history of the Jews have been treated as outsiders and scapegoats. So they were likely to be segregated off into ghettos and forced to live separately. They didn't choose to live separately; they were forced to live separately from the rest of society. Obviously, the Jewish population were a minority everywhere. So wherever they lived, they were a minority. They'd lost their own homeland, and so the Jewish community in Europe was then treated with this great suspicion, and anything that went wrong as in literally anything that went wrong, tended to be blamed on the Jewish population. So, for example, in England, they got blamed for the plague. They got blamed for the fire of London. Now, clearly, these things were not done by the Jewish population. They were not to blame for this. But because of people's ignorance and the lack of understanding, and because you had a minority group that people didn't quite understand, then they tended to get blamed for things. And sometimes this could be turned into violence. This is known as pogroms, and these continued all the way through the Middle Ages and an early modern period, and all the way through. I mean, for example, if you look at in Russia, these are still going on in the late 19th and early 20th century. So pogroms are riotous, kind of violent attacks on the Jews, and there's one we'll look at in the coursework called the Hep riots in 1819 in Germany. And so essentially across Europe in the medieval and early modern period, Jews were denied the rights that other people held. So, and this could be fundamental things like they weren't allowed to own land, they weren't allowed to take part in elections, they weren't allowed to hold office. There was lots of different things they weren't allowed to do, places they weren't allowed to go. And another part of this is you had Jewish religious laws and practices that were often then used by anti-Semites as proof that they weren't part of the nation and chose to be separate. So, for example, beliefs in Judaism about your position of being Jewish flowing through your having a Jewish mother, the fact that it's not an evangelical faith in the same way that Christianity is, where you're not trying to convert people, and it having different kind of cultural and religious practices meant people looked at it and went, look, they are different and they aren't doing things like we are doing. And that led to a great deal of anti-Semitism as well. Now, I've already mentioned the Shylock example, which kind of came out of religious practice, and this really has been a real central theme of anti-Semitism through history. It is, of course, nonsense, but it's almost created by the community that then accuses them of it, in that because a lot of these Christian countries had laws that stopped Jewish people doing most other areas of work, they weren't allowed to make money in the traditional way of owning land and farming and things like that. Then they had to work in the areas that they were allowed to work, and one of these was money lending and banking and in trade and industry. And so this really negative stereotype of Jews as being greedy money lenders developed in this period. And Jewish population did predominantly work in finance and business and in the professions, often with education being so highly prized in the Jewish community that you would find lots of lawyers and doctors and teachers and university professors who were Jewish. Now, anti-Semites then, they turn this on this head, and they use that to try and prove their point and support their prejudice. As you get greater urbanization and industrialization in the 19th century, the kind of focus of wealth and business shifts from the traditional model of land ownership that the Jews have been excluded from. So actually the Jewish community, out of this change in urbanization, industrialization, actually did really quite well. In the 1870s, 2/3 of German Jews were in the middle and upper tax levels. If we go through to Weimar Germany, in 1919 through to 1933, then the Jews were less than 1% of the population, but 11% of doctors were Jewish, 16% of lawyers were Jewish, 50% of the private banks were Jewish owned, 80% of department stores were Jewish owned. Now, in some ways, there's another story that we will look at another point, which is the story of great Jewish success, and that this shows that huge amounts of the population aren't prejudiced, because otherwise they wouldn't be using Jewish lawyers, Jewish doctors, going to Jewish banks, using Jewish department stores. There's loads of incredible Jewish achievement in industries like art and music and media, which again suggests that a huge part of the Jewish German population, or populations across Europe, are not anti-Semitic. But there were those who were anti-Semitic. This fed jealousy, and this then led to increases in anti-Semitism. And this was particularly strong at the time of any economic crisis or economic downturn. So if an economy crashed or an economy slowed down, went into recession, then anti-Semitism tended to rise as people blamed the Jews for the economic crisis. Just like in the earlier times, they blamed them for things they couldn't explain like plague and fire, in the more modern world, they were blamed for economic crises. And we see this really strongly in Germany, and we see it elsewhere in Europe as well. Right. So some of our kind of important anti-Semitic writers that kind of really build these ideas, and they're going to mean that they are prevalent amongst the populations as we go forward. Wilhelm Marr is the guy who is, I credit's the wrong word, but he's the guy who's said to have come up with this term, anti-Semitism, made it popular. He accused the Jews in Hamburg of misusing their emancipation and concentrating on economic advantage, feeding in back to some of our earlier ideas. I mean, showing that this wasn't universally agreed with. There was kind of outrage at these ideas, and he wasn't re-elected to the Hamburg Parliament. Marr is a very odd character. I mean, both his first and second wives were Jewish. His third wife had some Jewish parentage as well. But he said that the Jews were not part of the German Volk, the German people. Now that is a message that you'll see echoed when we get through into the Nazis. And his most famous piece of writing was in 1879 when he wrote about the pamphlet was called "The Way to Victory of Germanism over Judaism," and his argument was that Germans and Jews could not coexist. One must destroy the other to survive, and to prevent what he called Jewish victory, he created the German League of Anti-Semites that was going to champion the idea that the Jews must be expelled from Germany. So those ideas are around and being promoted by Marr in 1879, and obviously we will see those ideas being used by groups such as the Nazis in the 20th century. Now, Marr was ideas running alongside a new development in anti-Semitism, which was the most horrendous of all of them, I think, which was this idea of racial anti-Semitism. And this stopped treating Judaism as a religion, and kind of didn't really look at cultural differences and things like that. What it did is it kind of badged Jews as being a race. Now, Jews are not a race. There are Jewish people of all different races, but being Jewish is more than a religion, and you'll often have people of Jewish origin who will still see themselves as Jewish, but they won't necessarily be practicing and go to a synagogue or anything like that. So it's an area to be very careful with, because obviously referring to the Jewish people as a race is offensive and is not true. But this was the idea that people in a group of writers in the mid-19th century started to really push. One of the most important of them was a French writer, Count Joseph Arthur de Gobineau, and he talked about race, and he talks about the human races being unequal. And he talks about them being physically and psychologically different. And he says that essentially the best race is the Aryan race, and he talks about other races being less valuable. And he talks about the problems of the mixing of the races. So hugely offensive, horrible stuff, but something that was going to have an important role going forward, and particularly in Nazi ideology. Another kind of key writer from the 19th century was Eugene Deering. He was an economist, and again, this stuff is absolutely vile. He talked about Jews being scarcely human, and enemies of all nations, especially Germany. And again, you can see this in things that Hitler will say and act on when he's in power. One of the very sinister things out of the writing of Deering is he said that all human traits were racially determined. And we see this put into action by the Nazis in terms of, for example, when they're selecting members for the SS, they're more interested in their racial ancestry than they are in actually testing their ability in anything. And it has a really sinister kind of connotation in terms of it believes that people are unalterable. They are, and therefore their race will make them a certain way. And if you then kind of connect that with Gobineau's ideas of the inequality of human races and Deering's idea of them being scarcely human, this leads to the terrible, terrible anti-Semitism that's picked up by the Nazis. Another really important writer is a guy called Stewart Chamberlain, who is actually British, British American, but he marries marries the daughter of Richard Wagner, who's a really famous German composer who was also an anti-Semite and had written about Jewishness in music and attacked all kind of ideas of Jewish creativity in music. In 1899, Chamberlain published his own key work, The Foundations of the 19th Century. And again, we can see the language. This is absolutely horrible. He talked about the Jews in terms of racial aspects again, and talked about them being bent on world domination. Now, this echoes earlier writing, the writing of Marr and Deering, but he's really, really significant. He is Hitler's favourite writer, is Chamberlain, and you can see Hitler's ideas are not original. They are just taken from this earlier work, and in some really interesting studies where people have gone and looked at Hitler and the kind of work that he looked at, then we can see that he had signed copies of Chamberlain's book, and actually where is reports that Hitler describes the day on meeting Chamberlain as one of his proudest and most favourite moments in his life. So this really has a profound impact on anti-Semitism going forward and the horrors of the Holocaust. Right, another area of anti-Semitism that emerged, it was a link between Jewish people and communism. So this really starts the end of the 19th century, start of the 20th century, with Jews being very strongly associated with communism by certain kind of right-wing anti-Semitic groups. It makes no sense at all. It is ridiculous, particularly because communism rejects religion altogether. But the anti-Semites then would state, well, Karl Marx was Jewish. There's lots of Jews who played key roles in the communist revolution, such as Lenin and Trotsky, who had Jewish blood. In Germany, there was a communist revolutionary leader, Rosa Luxemburg, who was also Jewish by birth. And so a lot of these anti-Semites started to connect these bits together. You then get this completely insane conspiracy theory. It was a Russian forgery from the turn of the century. It was shown to be a forgery within a matter of a few years, and it's called the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. Now, it claimed that the Jews controlled the banks in the West, most notably in New York, and that they were working with the communist Jews in Russia to take over the world. It's utterly ridiculous. It makes no sense whatsoever, but there was lots of people who believed it, notably Hitler. Henry Ford was a firm believer in it. It's still occasionally you will see it referred to in anti-Semitic material even today. So this idea that communists and bankers would be in cahoots together is obviously mad, but it is something that it was really important in the development of anti-Semitism and in particularly Hitler's anti-Semitism. Now, Nazi anti-Semitism is a really weird combination of some of these strands of anti-Semitism that run through history. So they attack the Jews for their economic power and their wealth, and we see lots of stuff that the Nazis do where they confiscate Jewish property and Jewish wealth, and Hitler was obsessed with them controlling the banks and finance and everything, really. But then combining that with racial anti-Semitism, which argues that the Jews were an inferior race, was the argument, which is obviously nonsense and not a race to start off with. But it's particularly nonsense if you combine it with the first strand of anti-Semitism. So the Jews control everything, but are inferior. It's mad. It's utterly bonkers. And then you added onto it, there was a bit that Hitler really strongly believed in, was that all Jews were communists. So the Jews who run the banking systems are communists. The Jews who are wealthy, and we must remove their wealth, are again, it's completely nonsensical, and it goes into this idea of Jewish dominance and world power. Now, one area of anti-Semitism the Nazis weren't really interested in was the oldest form of anti-Semitism, which is the religious form. Now, just because Hitler and other Nazis ignored it doesn't mean that might not necessarily have been the reason why some German people supported Nazi anti-Semitism. So it's not what the idea the Nazis were pushing, but might be a reason why it accepted that strand of anti-Semitism still existed at the time of the Nazis. Right. thank you very much for watching. Hopefully this will help you working on your coursework, or help give you an understanding of the different types of anti-Semitism that have existed through time in Europe. Not very uplifting video, I'm sorry, but it shows us some of the terrible ideas that exist in the world. And to conquer and to counter these horrible ideas, we need to know that they exist and where they come from. Right, thank you very much for watching.